They said the Japanese didn't care if their bombers burned. That was what the Americans believed, until the day they stood beneath one. December 8, 1943, somewhere in the South Pacific. The sun was brutal that morning. Heat shimmered above the crushed coral runway, and in the middle of it stood something none of them had ever seen before. A captured Japanese bomber. Not wreckage, not twisted metal, but an almost intact aircraft with its green paint still glistening under the light. The Mitsubishi G4M. The Allies called it the Betty. The men circled it cautiously. Mechanics, pilots, engineers. They had seen hundreds of these planes before, but always through gun sights, always on fire. They had watched them explode into orange balls over the Solomon Islands, their crews consumed in seconds. But this one was whole, silent, and still smelled faintly of gasoline. The first thing they noticed was how light it looked. The fuselage panels were thin, almost fragile. When one of the engineers tapped it with his knuckle, the sound was hollow, like striking an empty can. As they opened the wings, confusion spread. There were no armored plates, no fireproof layers. The fuel tanks ran through the wings like unprotected veins of metal, no rubber lining, no self-sealing design, no insulation. It was the kind of construction that would horrify any American designer. One spark, one tracer round, and this thing would become a torch in the sky, and yet Japanese pilots flew it across thousands of miles of ocean, often without escort, carrying torpedoes, bombs, and dreams of victory. One of the officers, Lieutenant Jack Sanderson, wrote in his notebook that day, "This aircraft seems suicidal in its design. Either their engineers are mad, or their pilots are saints." It wasn't madness, it was something deeper, something no one in the West could yet understand. The Betty bomber wasn't a mistake, it was a statement. In 1939, the Imperial Japanese Navy demanded a new long-range bomber. It had to reach the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, or even Australia without refueling. It had to be fast, light, and able to carry a heavy load. Mitsubishi's lead engineer, Kiro Honjo, accepted the challenge. To give the plane range, he needed to make it lighter than anything else in the sky. He removed armor. He removed the protective plates around the crew. He stripped out every non-essential safety feature. No bulletproof glass, no fire suppression, no self-sealing tanks, nothing that added weight. The result was astonishing. The G4M could fly over 3,000 miles, faster and farther than any American bomber of its time. It was sleek, graceful, efficient, and fatally vulnerable. American pilots who fought in the Pacific soon gave it a nickname, the Flying Cigar. Once hit, it burned completely. Japanese crews knew it too. They called it hamaki, which meant cigar. They joked about it in nervous laughter before missions, calling themselves the smoke that followed the fire. Everyone who flew the Betty knew. It was fragile, but they also believed in something far stronger than metal. They believed in sacrifice. When the Americans examined the cockpit, they found small paper charms taped to the instrument panels. A few handwritten notes in Japanese, prayers, a small origami crane beside the navigator's seat. These men hadn't flown to survive. They had flown to serve. Inside one recovered pilot's diary, Sanderson's team found the same sentence written again and again. To die for the Emperor is to live forever. That one line changed everything the Americans thought they understood about their enemy. They realized they weren't fighting soldiers driven by survival. They were fighting men driven by faith. The Betty was fast, but it was also merciless to its own crew. A single bullet to the fuel line would ignite the entire plane. The crew had less than 10 seconds to escape before the fuselage became a furnace. Yet missions continued. Betty bombers struck targets across the Pacific, often far beyond the limits of safety. Some even managed to sink major Allied warships. They were fragile, but they were also feared. Their long-range torpedoes could cripple destroyers and carriers before they even knew an attack had begun. The price was always the same. Few, if any, Betty crews returned. By 1943, American intelligence had started collecting fragments of downed Bettys, but this was the first time they had one almost untouched. They studied it for days, stripping each panel, measuring every inch of the fuel tanks, tracing the wiring through the wings. The longer they studied, the more disturbing it became. This was not poor engineering. It was deliberate philosophy. Japan's military didn't value protection. They valued reach, speed, and the purity of purpose. They believed a bomber that could reach its target even if it never returned was already victorious. The machine didn't matter. The mission did. To the Americans, it was unthinkable. Their bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, were built like tanks. Armor everywhere, thick glass, defensive turrets, redundant systems. The Betty had none of that. Its best defense was distance and luck. Yet somehow it had carried Japan through the first years of the war with terrifying success. From the skies over Malaya to the sinking of the British ships, Prince of Wales and Repulse, Betty bombers had written their legend in fire and smoke. But by late 1943, that legend was dying. American fighters were now faster, stronger, and deadlier. Every new Betty that left the Mitsubishi plant had shorter odds of returning home. Still, they flew. Still, they fought. Still, they burned. When the inspection at Repulse ended, Sanderson stood at the edge of the runway and looked back one last time. The sun was setting, painting the sky red over the Pacific. The captured Betty stood there quietly, its green body glowing in the light, riddled with holes, ghostly and beautiful. He knew he was looking at something more than an aircraft. He was looking at a symbol of a nation's belief in sacrifice over survival. The final report he filed contained only one simple conclusion. The Betty is not poorly made. It is made for men who do not expect to live. That sentence would later circulate through every Allied design office. It forced American engineers to rethink what courage, duty, and survival meant in modern war. The photograph they took that day would be titled "The Ghost of Rabaul." To most, it was just a captured bomber. To those who stood there, it was a message written in metal. The Japanese hadn't built this plane to last. They had built it to prove something. That conviction was stronger than armor. It was belief turned into steel and fire. Next, we'll go deeper inside the fuselage to see what the Americans found when they opened its heart. The strange secrets hidden beneath its frame, and how this fragile, burning machine ended up changing how the Allies designed their own bombers. That's where the real story begins. The last men to touch that captured Betty left quietly. They closed the access panels and walked back to the waterlogged tents, where they wrote reports by oil lamp. They spoke in low voices about the men who had flown these planes. They spoke of duty and of the terrible arithmetic of war. The captured bomber had begun as an object of ridicule and ended as a haunting teacher. That teaching extended beyond the hangar. In the months that followed, Allied tactics evolved. Escort ranges increased. Fighter interception techniques adapted. Armor and self-sealing systems were prioritized in new models. Intelligence analysts briefed commanders on what to expect when enemy pilots accepted risk as doctrine. Above all, the captured G4M remained in memory as proof that technology does not float in isolation. It carries with it the ideas, beliefs, and sacrifices of those who built and flew it. Next, we will follow how those lessons moved from the lab to the front. We will trace the tactical changes that reduced losses and the human stories that emerged when the G4M's ghost met the improving Allied machine. The men gathered around the strange aircraft like archaeologists, uncovering an artifact from another world. The captured Betty bomber sat under the blistering Pacific sun, Its green paint faded, the red circles on its wings already scratched off by curious hands. Captain Lewis ran a palm across the fuselage, feeling the smooth, thin metal. It dented slightly under his touch. "This thing's paper thin," he muttered. No one disagreed. They were looking at an airplane that should not have been able to fly into combat, let alone return from it. Yet the Japanese had sent hundreds of these bombers across the Pacific skies. Inside the wreck, the air smelled of gasoline and mildew. Wires hung loose from the cockpit ceiling. The control yoke was scarred by shrapnel. Sergeant O'Malley leaned in from the side hatch, shining a flashlight on the instrument panel. "Jesus, look at this, Cap. It's all written in kanji. And no armor behind the seats. One burst and the pilot's gone." Lewis nodded slowly. He'd seen Japanese fighters before, light and fragile but fast. This was something else. This was suicide in aluminum form. Two mechanics from the engineering unit joined them, carrying clipboards and cameras. They began photographing every inch of the plane. One pointed his pencil at the fuel lines, snaking beneath the floor panels. "These are fuel tanks," he said, confused. "But there's no self-sealing coating, none at all. In American and British bombers, fuel tanks were lined with thick rubber compounds that sealed bullet holes automatically. Without them, one tracer round could turn the entire aircraft into a fireball." Lewis blinked, stunned. "You're telling me they flew these into combat unprotected?" The mechanic shrugged. "Looks like it. Not even an inch of armor around them." Silence filled the bomber's interior. The only sound was the slow dripping of oil from the engine cowling. O'Malley whistled. No wonder they burned so easy. He was right. Allied pilots had long called Japanese bombers flying lighters, but seeing it up close made the nickname feel cruelly literal. Later that afternoon, the intelligence officers arrived from Port Moresby. They carried notebooks, blueprints, and a typewriter. Major Raymond Carter, the senior analyst, climbed into the cockpit and sat in the pilot's seat. "So this is the Betty," he said quietly. "We've been chasing her for months." He examined the gauges, the throttle, the thin seat back. Then he turned to Lewis. "Captain, tell your men to drain the fuel. We'll need samples." By nightfall, the plane was surrounded by spotlights. Technicians worked under the glow, removing panels, labeling components, cataloging everything from the propeller hubs to the radio set. They were shocked at what they found. Lightweight aluminum spars, rivets spaced far apart, no armor plating anywhere except around the machine guns. It was as if the designers had chosen speed and range over survival. Carter dictated his notes to a typist nearby. "This aircraft is faster than expected, range approximately 3,000 kilometers, but structurally fragile. No protection for crew or fuel system. Prioritizes offensive reach above defensive endurance." At midnight, Carter walked outside and lit a cigarette. The stars above the airfield shimmered. He exhaled slowly. "They built this to reach far," he said to Lewis, who stood beside him. "Not to come home," the captain frowned. "Why would anyone design it like that?" Carter dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "Because they thought they wouldn't need to come back. That's what scares me." Over the next few days, more details emerged. The captured Betty had belonged to the 753rd Kokutai, one of Japan's elite naval bomber units. It had been forced down after a raid on New Guinea, its engines damaged by flak. The crew had bailed out, and most were captured. Under interrogation, one surviving gunner revealed something chilling. "We were told," he said through a translator, "that the Emperor watches us. Dying for him is victory. Returning alive is shame." That single sentence echoed through the intelligence camp like thunder. It explained everything: the paper-thin armor, the unsealed tanks, the reckless attacks. These bombers weren't meant to survive. They were meant to deliver death and vanish in fire. Carter's report reached Washington within days. The analysis shocked the Allied High Command. The Japanese had sacrificed durability for range, designing the Betty to strike from unimaginable distances across the Pacific, carrying torpedoes capable of crippling battleships. In the briefing rooms of Pearl Harbor, officers studied the photographs of the captured plane. One admiral reportedly muttered, "They built a weapon, not an aircraft." Engineers at Wright Field examined copies of the technical data and shook their heads in disbelief. The slightest hit, one said, and this whole thing would erupt, yet they kept flying them. As weeks passed, American pilots began to understand their enemy's mindset. They realized that Japanese crews flew with the knowledge that any hit could ignite their plane, yet they still pressed attacks fearlessly. It wasn't just a machine. They were facing an ideology built on honor, sacrifice, and fatalism. Carter wrote in his final report, "The Betty bomber is both a triumph and a tragedy, a marvel of range and efficiency, doomed by its own fragility. Its designers valued reach more than life. Perhaps that is why its pilots fought with such desperation. They had no margin for error, no shield but faith. But even then, no one realized how close the Allies had come to disaster. Because inside that same captured bomber, hidden beneath a false floor panel, the engineers would soon find something that changed everything they thought they knew about Japanese aviation. Something that would lead to one of the most secret investigations of the entire war." The next morning, the tropical airfield was wrapped in mist. Mechanics were already at work when Captain Lewis arrived, coffee in hand, boots still muddy from the rain. The Betty bomber sat silent under a tarpaulin, its fuselage stripped and half disassembled. One of the engineers, Lieutenant Parker, waved him over. "Captain, you'd better see this." They had removed a section of flooring behind the bomb bay. Beneath it was a compartment no one had noticed before, a narrow metal box riveted shut. It wasn't listed on any blueprint they had. Parker had already drilled through the rivets and pried the lid open. Inside lay a tangled network of small glass cylinders, wires, and what looked like a compact radio transmitter. Lewis frowned. "That's not part of any standard bomber setup." Carter arrived minutes later, notebook under his arm. He knelt beside the open compartment, examining the glass tubes. "Vacuum tubes," he murmured. "But for what?" "There's no antenna routed here." Parker pointed to a cable leading toward the tail. "That line runs through the fuselage. Maybe they were experimenting with remote guidance or homing beacons." Carter's expression darkened. "If that's true, this isn't just a bomber. It's a test platform. The discovery threw the intelligence unit into chaos. For hours they traced the cables, removing panels and photographing each stage. It became clear the system was intentionally concealed. One of the technicians whispered, "It's like they didn't want even their own crews to know it was there." By afternoon, the entire device was laid out on a tarp. The setup was primitive, but advanced for its time, something between a radar transponder and a signal repeater. Carter's mind raced. They might have been trying to track their own bombers, or maybe guide torpedoes. Whatever it wasn't ordinary. News of the discovery reached Allied command by evening. Orders came swiftly. The device was to be shipped under guard to Pearl Harbor for full analysis. But before it was crated, Carter insisted on one more test. "Let's power it up," he said. Parker hesitated. "Sir, we don't even know what it does." Carter gave a half smile. "That's why we're going to find out." They connected a generator and carefully fed voltage through the system. The glass tubes began to glow a faint orange. A high-pitched hum filled the air. Suddenly, a flicker of static crackled through a nearby radio set. Then a voice, distorted, ghostly, echoed in the room. None of them spoke Japanese, but the tone was unmistakable, calm, mechanical, and looping, as if a pre-recorded transmission had been playing endlessly in the ether. The airmen stared in silence. Parker turned off the power. The voice vanished. "What the hell was that?" O'Malley asked quietly. Carter looked at him, face pale. "A signal." "But from where?" That night the camp was uneasy. The idea that the Japanese had been experimenting with advanced communication or tracking technology unsettled everyone. Until then, Allied forces had assumed Japan lagged far behind in electronic warfare. But this changed everything. The next day, a transport plane arrived to carry the device to Pearl Harbor. 2 armed guards stood watch as it was loaded aboard. Carter watched it go, rubbing his temples. "We just opened a door," he told Lewis, "and I'm not sure what's on the other side." 2 weeks later, the analysis came back. The engineers at Pearl Harbor identified the device as part of an experimental radar detection system. It could pick up certain frequencies emitted by Allied search radars and transmit them back to Japanese bases. That meant the Betty bomber they'd captured might have been flying a reconnaissance mission, designed to locate American fleets without ever being seen. The implications were staggering. If the Japanese could detect Allied radar positions, they could plan surprise attacks again, just like early in the war. But the report contained another detail that chilled Carter to his core. The system's frequency logs showed multiple recorded transmissions, not just from the South Pacific, but from points stretching all the way toward the Marianas. It meant there were others. More Betty bombers out there equipped with the same mysterious device. Carter gathered his men that evening. "Gentlemen," he said, "this isn't over. If they're tracking our radar, our fleets are vulnerable. Every convoy, every patrol. We need to know how many of these are out there." The camp went silent. The distant hum of aircraft engines echoed over the airfield as night fell. Lewis leaned against a jeep, staring toward the dark horizon. "So do you really think they'll risk sending more of these fragile things that far out?" Carter didn't answer for a moment. "They've done worse," he finally said. "And if they think it'll buy them another victory, they'll burn 1,000 more." Weeks later, American patrols in the Solomon Islands began reporting strange signals, faint electronic echoes that didn't match any known Allied transmission. Navy codebreakers believed they were related to the Betty system. Soon, a new mission was organized: capture another bomber intact. Carter was assigned as lead observer. Before dawn on January 11, 1944, a formation of P-38s scrambled from Guadalcanal to intercept a group of Bettys flying low over the sea. The engagement was brutal and fast. One Betty burst into flames, another plunged into the water. But a third, badly damaged, managed to crash land on a small island north of Bougainville. Carter's team was sent immediately. When they reached the wreckage, what they found made the first discovery look almost ordinary. Because inside that second bomber, they uncovered not just electronics, but handwritten blueprints sealed in an oilskin envelope, bearing a name that no one in the Allied command had seen before. A single word, written in neat katakana script, Fugaku. Carter looked at it and whispered, "What the hell is Fugaku?" He didn't know it yet, but that word would lead them into the most secret Japanese project of the entire war, a weapon so ambitious it could have changed the fate of the Pacific. The name on the cracked oilskin envelope felt like a code, not a word. Fugaku. Carter held the paper with fingers that trembled more from fatigue than fear. He had seen many Japanese notations by then, names of squadrons and factory stamps, but this was different. The neat katakana suggested formality, maybe a program, maybe an idea hidden under bureaucracy. Parker leaned closer and traced the characters with a gloved fingertip. "They didn't write that in pencil," he said. "Whoever made this wanted it to last." They unrolled the blueprints on the hood of a jeep beneath a leaking tarp. The lines were tight, oceans of measurements and annotations in tiny script. At first glance, the diagrams looked like radio schematics, but embedded among them were airflow charts and antenna placements along the wing routes and empennage. Someone had tried to integrate electronics into the airframe in ways that American engineers rarely did then. It was as if they had sketched a ship of the air that could think about the signals it encountered, not just the wind and its fuel. Major Carter felt the old, familiar spike of certainty that came when intelligence revealed a larger pattern. This was not an add-on. This was a program. Carter wrote a single line in the margin of his notebook. Fugaku, system integration, signal detection, remote reporting. He did not know the full meaning, but he believed he had seen the map of something ambitious. Back in Port Moresby, analysts worked through the night. Linguists pored over the notebooks recovered from the downed crew. Mechanics cross-referenced radio part numbers with Mitsubishi supply lists. Wright Field chipped away at the technical drawings. Piece by piece, a portrait emerged. Fugaku was a project to build a distributed sensing and reporting capability across aircraft and island outposts. The goal was simple and terrifying. If the Japanese forces could sense Allied radar emissions and then relay that information across great distances, they could blindfold and bait convoys, orchestrate ambushes, and time strikes with deadly precision. The name Fugaku, Carter learned later, referred to a mythic image of Mount Fuji, a sentinel that sees far. It suited the project, a sentinel rising to watch the vast ocean. The pilots who lugged these fragile planes across the Pacific had unwittingly become parts of a larger net that would, if completed, stretch like a spiderweb across the sea. That revelation forced changes in how the Allies planned operations. Convoys were rerouted. Patrol patterns were varied to deprive any sensor of regularity. Radar operators were trained to use blanking sequences and decoy pulses. Yet even as tactics shifted, the sea remained a place of danger. One intercepted Betty transmission suggested that Fugaku components could also be used to home torpedoes or to coordinate nighttime approaches against ships' less defended flanks. The idea that a small, unarmored plane could carry the seeds of a tactical revolution chilled officers who had previously dismissed the enemy's electronic capabilities. Amid the technical panic, the human stories kept surfacing. The crew manifest of the downed Betty listed names that the intelligence officers slowly translated. A 30-year-old pilot who had been a mechanic before the war, a navigator who had once run a shipping office in Nagoya, a radio operator known to his family for tinkering with crystal sets. Carter kept photographs of their faces pinned to his board. He could not shake the image of the radio operator, fingers stained with solder, now part of a secret program whose reach could cost lives on both sides. As men around him debated strategies, Carter arranged a risky plan. They would try to capture another Fugaku-equipped Betty intact, and if possible, capture a crew alive for interrogation. The operation would require luck, precise timing, and a measure of cruelty to lure such a bomber into a situation where it could be disabled but not destroyed. They could not bombard every aircraft that flew. Their goal was to expose the system. Intelligence decided to use a trap, an apparently vulnerable convoy escorted by fast P-38s, patrolling above and destroyers ready to pick. Through the wreckage, if any plane landed intact, the trap was sprung. The sea glittered under a half-moon. Radios whispered with coded reports. A Betty came in low, its silhouette long and cigar-shaped against the pale water. Fighter pilots vectored in, engines a whisper in the darkness. The engagement was brutal. Black lit the sky like distant fireworks. One Betty stalled and plunged into the surf. Another skimmed the waves and disappeared into the black. Then, impossibly, a third went down on a coral shelf, its wheels crushing the reef and its tail snapping like a matchstick. Men in rubber boats timed to the surf pulled survivors from the water. One was barely conscious, the radio operator, his skin scorched and face smeared with oil. He carried a small metal canister filled with papers. It would prove crucial. Interrogation was a delicate process. The man spoke haltingly through a translator. He was no fanatic, Carter realized. He was tired, hungry, practical. Yet through his broken sentences, a consistent motif emerged. Fugaku had been pushed by a small group within the Navy who believed technology could compensate for mortal weakness. They argued that Japan could not match the industrial might of the Allies, and therefore must be cleverer, faster, and more hidden. The radio operator's face tightened when Carter asked about crews' chances of survival. "We were told to trust the net," he said. "If the net works, we will be safe. If not, we must accept the Emperor." The operator's confession offered more than doctrine. He described test flights that had flown along routes designed to pick up radar reflections, nights when crews were forced to fly past picket ships and record echoes. He spoke of engineers who rode along to measure antenna performance. He told of an order to mark certain islands as nodes, places where secret receivers would be hidden in coconut groves and under airstrip huts. The Fugaku project was not confined to a lab. It was field-tested across the Pacific. Its reach was already longer than American planners had allowed. With these human details, the plan moved from theory to urgency. Carter briefed a small circle of commanders and technicians. He emphasized that the Japanese did not merely build fragile planes for ideology. They had combined that ideology with a network that could change outcomes at sea. The Allies needed to break the net. If they could capture blueprints and components, they could develop countermeasures, design decoys, and, crucially, avoid walking into traps. What followed was a frantic race. Scientists at Pearl Harbor reverse-engineered, captured circuits, and designed pulse sequences to confuse the Fugaku receivers. Convoy commanders practiced mission discipline. Reconnaissance expanded to find and dismantle suspected node sites on remote islands. Sometimes the breakthroughs were technical. Sometimes they were human. An island schoolteacher who used to hide parts of radio equipment in a jar of pickled ginger became an unexpected asset for Allied intelligence, offering directions to a concealed receiver in exchange for safe passage off the island. But the war rarely yielded simple victories. Every countermeasure led to adaptation. The Japanese refined receiver sensitivity. They shifted frequencies. They began to use short, unpredictable bursts of transmission to avoid easy detection. The Fugaku network learned in fits and starts, because learning was the work of engineers and desperate men. It was not a monolith. It was improvisation, courage, and small, brutal choices pressed by a nation seeing itself on the ropes. As the months passed, Carter watched the impact of Fugaku ripple through operations. Some convoys altered their routes and were spared surprise attacks. In other cases, the network still found a seam, and ambushes raged with murderous speed. Naval officers learned to respect the idea of an enemy that wired its will into devices, and sent those devices out in the hands of men who believed death carried meaning. The G4M that had started as a curiosity on a coral airstrip had become a fulcrum. It connected design, doctrine, and destiny in a way that reshaped the Pacific War. Late one night in the intelligence hut, Carter turned over the final photograph in his stack. It was of the radio operator taken while his wounds were being dressed. The man's eyes were closed. His mouth was slack with exhaustion. Carter felt a hollow in his chest. The story of Fugaku had begun with metal and diagrams, but it threaded through flesh and hometowns and wives who watched the sea. The intelligence victory was technical. The moral calculus remained uneasy. A month later, a new dispatch arrived, stamped top secret. It contained intercepted Japanese transmissions and fragments of Fugaku design modifications. Carter read it at dawn with a coffee gone cold. The last page bore a single line that made him drop the paper. Fugaku was evolving. New schematics suggested integration with guidance aids that could direct torpedoes to a target once the network triangulated a ship's position. If true, the net would not just watch. It would deliver death with a precision previously unseen. Carter stared at the ocean horizon where the first Betty had been found. He felt the weight of choices made in rooms like this one. He knew the Allies had to move faster, build better traps, and perhaps make enemies of small islands and hidden labs. Above all, he knew that the next months would decide whether Fugaku remained a dangerous experiment or became a weapon that could change the face of the Pacific. They had exposed the net, but they had not yet torn it down. That would be a task of men and machines, of raids and sabotage, of codebreakers and islanders. It would demand cunning and brutality and, at times, mercy. The captured blueprints had shown how a fragile bomber could carry a continent's ambition. The rest of the story would show whether that ambition could be stopped. Next, we will follow the Allied response in harrowing detail. We will track sabotage missions that cut the net, pilots who baited the traps, and the very moment when Fugaku nearly tilted the balance of a major engagement. We will meet men who chose to betray, and others who chose to die believing they served something larger than themselves. The trail leads to a single night when everything that had been learned would be put to the proof. By early 1944, the Pacific War had turned into a contest of endurance and innovation. Battles were no longer decided only by who had more planes or ships, but by who could see first, strike first, and vanish. The Japanese, driven by desperation, poured what resources they had left into programs like Fugaku. Allied planners were only beginning to understand how far those experiments had gone. In a dimly lit intelligence room in Port Moresby, Carter stood before a map covered in pins and red thread. Each pin marked a confirmed or suspected Fugaku transmission site. They stretched like a chain from Rabaul to the Marianas, each one small, each one insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern that resembled a net cast across the Pacific. "We're not fighting an army," Carter said quietly to his aide. "We're fighting a nervous system." The Allies decided on an unorthodox approach. Instead of waiting for more bombers to appear, they would attack the network itself. They called it Operation Embernet. Small teams of commandos, engineers, and native scouts would land on islands suspected of housing Fugaku relay equipment, locate the receivers, and destroy them before the Japanese could adapt. The first mission launched under moonlight. A group of 12 men, led by Lieutenant Parker, landed on a nameless island east of Truk. The jungle swallowed them instantly. Mosquitoes hummed. Somewhere in the darkness, waves crashed on coral. Guided by a crude radio direction finder, the team moved inland. After 3 hours, they came upon a clearing, and in its center stood a bamboo hut surrounded by barbed wire. Inside, faint radio static leaked through the walls. They had found it, Parker signaled the demolition men. But just as they approached, a voice shouted in Japanese. 2 guards appeared from the shadows, rifles raised. The firefight lasted seconds. 1 guard fell. The other fled into the jungle. Within minutes, the hut was in flames, its equipment sizzling in the heat. Parker radioed the success signal and they pulled out exhausted, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. The mission had proved one thing. The Fugaku network was real and active. Over the next months, similar raids struck island after island. Some were bloodless, others ended in chaos. On one atoll, a team discovered that the receivers had been built into fake coconut trunks, their antennas disguised as palm leaves. On another, they found a warehouse filled with crates labeled as medical supplies, each hiding components for new transmitters. Every victory came with a cost. Men died in silence, their bodies left in the surf so the network could be blinded 1 node at a time. Meanwhile, Carter coordinated from headquarters, reading intercepted reports with a heavy heart. He watched patterns shift on the map as red pins turned black, one by one. "We're cutting the net," he told his staff. "But they're weaving it faster than we can burn it." Then came the report from Guam. A reconnaissance plane had photographed a new type of bomber, parked near a hangar, unlike any seen before. Its fuselage was larger, its wings longer, its tail marked with an emblem shaped like Mount Fuji. The intelligence analysts had no doubts. The next evolution of the Betty was ready, the Fugaku bomber. The photographs sent shockwaves through Allied command. The new aircraft, codenamed Type R, appeared capable of reaching distances far beyond anything previously built by Japan. Some experts believed it could fly from Tokyo to Hawaii and back without refueling. The discovery triggered panic. If the Japanese truly possessed a long-range bomber equipped with the Fugaku network, they could strike American bases again, maybe even the mainland. Orders went out for immediate reconnaissance. Submarines and long-range patrol aircraft were deployed to confirm the existence of this new machine. Weeks passed before they spotted it again. Cruising at high altitude over the Philippine Sea, radar barely registered it. Pilots who saw it described a sleek silhouette with narrow wings and massive engines that sounded like a swarm of hornets. Carter pored over every detail. "They've done it," he murmured. "They built the mountain that sees all." But while the Allies struggled to prepare, the Japanese engineers behind Fugaku faced their own nightmare. Fuel shortages, sabotage, and relentless bombings made production almost impossible. The few prototypes that existed were hidden deep within underground tunnels near Osaka. There, Under the flicker of lantern light, technicians worked with trembling hands. Knowing that the war outside was collapsing, one young engineer, Lieutenant Saito, wrote in his notebook, "They call it Fugaku, but it feels like a ghost. We build it knowing it will never truly fly as they dream. Yet still we build, because the idea of it gives our leaders hope." Those words would never reach Carter's desk until years later. But the truth was the same on both sides. The war had become a struggle to sustain faith as much as machinery. By June 1944, the tide had turned. The Allies captured Saipan, cutting off Japan's outer defenses. Carter's unit received orders to intercept any remaining Fugaku transmissions. Then one night, a strange signal pierced the airwaves, a coded burst lasting 6 seconds, unlike anything seen before. It repeated twice, then vanished. Carter ordered all listening posts to triangulate. The result stunned everyone. The source was moving east, fast, and at extreme altitude. A new type of aircraft was in the air. Within hours, radar stations across the Pacific scrambled to track it. One operator in the Marianas swore he saw a massive blip appear and then fade from his screen. Another reported an object flying at nearly 400 miles per hour. Interceptors were sent, but nothing was found. The next morning, a freighter convoy 200 miles north of Truk reported a faint droning overhead, followed by a flash on the horizon. A single ship was struck by what survivors described as a bomb that found us like it knew where we were. The Allies had feared it, and now it had happened. The Fugaku prototype had flown and attacked. The damage was limited, but the message was unmistakable. Japan still had reach, and it had used it. Carter received the report in silence. He placed his hands on the desk and stared at the map, his knuckles white. "We can't let them get another one airborne," he said. Not one. Operation Downfall, already in early planning stages, was amended to include specific strikes on suspected Fugaku facilities. American bombers began targeting the underground factories near Osaka and Nagoya. For weeks, firestorms raged across the industrial heart of Japan. Yet somewhere in those tunnels, a handful of engineers still worked, driven by the same quiet madness that had built the first unarmored Betty. When Tokyo finally fell quiet under the weight of surrender in August 1945, Carter sat alone in his tent. The war was over, but his mind kept circling back to the question that had haunted him since the day they found that first plane. Why build something that couldn't survive? He looked down at a scorched fragment of aluminum from the captured bomber, the paint still faintly showing the red circle of the rising sun. "Maybe," he said softly to himself. That was the point. They didn't build it to live. They built it to be remembered. But Carter would soon learn that the story of the Fugaku wasn't finished. Because as the occupation forces moved into Japan, they discovered documents far more detailed than anything he had seen, plans for something beyond even the Fugaku bomber. A design so vast and impossible that Allied engineers dismissed it as fantasy. Yet buried in those pages lay the blueprint for a dream Japan had been chasing since the start of the war. It was called Project Z, an aircraft that could cross the entire world without refueling. And it all began with the same idea that haunted the Allies from the moment they opened that captured bomber. Thin metal, fragile lives, and the belief that dying beautifully was better than surviving at all. By September 1945, Japan had surrendered. Smoke still lingered over Tokyo, and streets were littered with the remnants of a war that had consumed the Pacific. Allied occupation forces moved quickly, searching for documents, technology, and anything that could provide intelligence for the post-war world. Carter had returned to the Pacific Theater to supervise the cataloging of captured equipment, but even he was unprepared for what they were about to find. In a reinforced warehouse beneath the ruins of a Mitsubishi factory near Nagoya, engineers and intelligence officers discovered a set of crates marked with the same katakana name they had first seen, Fugaku. But inside these crates were not just parts. They contained detailed blueprints for Project Z, the ultimate evolution of the Fugaku bomber. The drawings were vast, filling sheets with measurements, fuel calculations, antenna placements and diagrams that made the Allied engineers' heads spin. Carter ran a finger along the plans. "This isn't a bomber," he whispered. "This is a continent on wings." The aircraft envisioned in Project Z was massive, far larger than any Allied bomber. Its wingspan dwarfed a B-29 superfortress, and its projected range was enough to fly non-stop from Japan to the United States and back. Every inch of its design bore the same ruthless philosophy that had defined the Betty: minimize armor, maximize fuel, prioritize mission over survival. Crew protection was almost non-existent, yet the machine itself was a marvel of aerodynamics and ingenuity. Lieutenant Parker examined the fuel schematics with a frown. "They want to carry something like 12,000 liters in unprotected tanks," he said. "One hit and—" Carter held up a hand. "Yes, one hit and it would go up in flames. But look at the range. If it worked, they could strike any base we have without warning." The blueprints also revealed a sophisticated network of electronics, building on the Fugaku system. Receivers and transmitters were integrated directly into the aircraft structure. There were diagrams for triangulating enemy radar and guiding bombs or torpedoes precisely to target. In theory, one plane could coordinate strikes over hundreds of miles while remaining almost invisible to conventional detection. It was the kind of technology the Allies would not see in practical form until decades later. As Carter studied the plans, he realized that the Japanese engineers had learned from every failure. The unarmored Bettys had taught them that bravery alone could not win. Project Z included redundant systems to monitor fuel, navigation, and electronics. Sensors could warn pilots of minor damage, and the autopilot was designed to maintain flight if the crew were incapacitated. It was still fragile, still suicidal in human terms, but it represented the culmination of Japanese ingenuity and obsession. One of the captured engineers, a wiry man named Hideo Tanaka, was brought in to explain the details. He spoke cautiously, knowing that mistrust could be fatal. "The bomber," he said through a translator, "was never meant to survive. It was meant to deliver its payload and complete the mission. Only a fool believes otherwise. We designed it to reach America if necessary, but we knew very few crews would return." Carter noticed the almost proud tone in Tanaka's voice. It mirrored the sentiments he had seen in the surviving Fugaku crews, fatalism mixed with devotion to a greater purpose. The Allied team began reconstructing the scale of the program. Factories in northern Honshu had been preparing components for multiple Project Z bombers. Test rigs had been built for engines far larger than anything yet deployed. Calculations showed that a single prototype could carry conventional bombs or specialized incendiary payloads across the Pacific, using high-altitude cruising to evade detection. It was a threat that had never been realized, only narrowly avoided by Japan's collapsing industrial capacity and the devastation of strategic bombing. Carter gathered the officers one evening, laying out the blueprints across a long table. "If even one of these had flown operationally," he said, tapping the plan, "we would have faced an unprecedented strike. Entire coastal cities could have been in range without warning." Parker ran his hands over the wingspan diagrams. "It's almost beautiful," he admitted. "A death machine, but beautiful." Carter nodded grimly. "That's what makes it terrifying. Despite the technical fascination, the human element could not be ignored. Allied personnel spent hours interviewing captured engineers and pilots, trying to understand how so many men could accept such suicidal missions. One former navigator admitted, "We were trained to die. It was shameful to survive. The plane was thin, yes, but our duty was to trust the mission, the net, and the Emperor." The sentiment was haunting. Carter understood the engineering marvel, but also the moral weight. These blueprints represented both genius and sacrifice, innovation and tragedy. The documents also revealed that Japan had intended Project Z to operate not as a single bomber, but as part of a coordinated system. Networks of Fugaku-equipped aircraft would relay intelligence, adjust trajectories in real time, and allow a small number of planes to strike far-reaching targets with unprecedented accuracy. The Americans realized that the entire strategy of the Japanese air forces had been evolving toward this terrifying vision, and only the destruction of facilities and Japan's surrender had prevented it from being realized. Carter and his team continued cataloging every component: engines, landing gear, avionics, fuel tanks, even pilot seat arrangements. Every detail was documented. The knowledge would inform Allied design for decades, accelerating improvements in range, fuel efficiency, and integrated avionics. Yet in the back of Carter's mind, one question lingered. Could human courage and sacrifice ever justify a machine so lethal, so vast and so fragile? Late that night, Carter sat alone, staring at the largest blueprint, tracing the lines of Project Z with his finger. He thought of the men who would have flown it, the engineers who had risked everything to build it, and the planes that had already burned in the Pacific. The airfield outside was silent. No planes, no engines, just the distant sound of waves and the occasional bird. He whispered to himself, they dreamed big, too big. But they dared, and that was the lesson Carter knew would echo far beyond the war. Ingenuity could reach astonishing heights, but the human cost of those heights was almost always unspeakable. Project Z would never fly, yet in its plans and in the captured Fugaku bombers, it left behind a story of ambition, sacrifice, and the haunting power of ideas carried to their extreme. The Allies had won, but the shadows of what could have been lingered over the Pacific. Carter closed the final folder, his mind replaying the first day he had touched the captured Betty. From fragile, paper-thin bombers to a continent-crossing dream of death, the story was complete, and yet, in its completeness, it demanded to be remembered. The war was over, but the Pacific still whispered the stories of planes that should never have flown. Carter walked along the makeshift runway where the first Betty had been captured months earlier. The air smelled faintly of salt and oil, a reminder of countless sorties, crashes, and the relentless push of men against machines that demanded more than they could give. He carried with him the final reports on Project Z, Fugaku, and every variant of the Japanese bombers he had encountered. He thought of the pilots who had flown into impossible odds, and their aircraft nothing more than paper and fuel, their survival nearly irrelevant to the mission. One name lingered in his mind: radio operator Nakamura. He had been captured after the second Fugaku-equipped Betty was downed. Carter remembered the exhausted young man, shivering and soaked, eyes wide but calm, holding the canister of blueprints as if it were a treasure. The courage and quiet resignation of men like Nakamura haunted him. They had flown machines that could kill in the blink of an eye, yet offered almost no chance of returning home. The Allied teams catalogued every component of the Fugaku network and Project Z engines. Fuselages, avionics, antennas, fuel tanks, everything was painstakingly documented. American engineers marveled at the ingenuity of the designs, the elegance of systems that could guide bombs, relay signals, and evade detection across thousands of miles. Yet they also shuddered at the fragility. One miscalculation, one stray trace around, one minor malfunction, and the entire plane and its crew would vanish in fire. It was a paradox, brilliance married to near certain death. Carter understood then that these planes represented more than technology. They embodied ideology, desperation, and a national obsession. Japan had poured its remaining industrial and human capital into machines that could reach unimaginable distances, hoping that speed, surprise, and faith would offset fragility. The Bettys, the Fugaku variants, and the plans for Project Z were all steps along a path defined not by survivability, but by daring. They were machines built to defy mortality, yet indifferent to it. He reflected on the Allies' narrow avoidance of disaster. Had Japan's industrial base been intact, had a few more prototypes survived, Project Z might have flown operationally. Cities, bases, and lives could have been at risk from a bomber network that spanned the Pacific. Every reconnaissance report, every intercepted transmission, every captured blueprint represented not only intelligence victory, but a reminder of how close the Allies had come to catastrophe. Carter's men often asked why they bothered to preserve so much of what they had captured. The answer, he realized, was historical memory. These planes and documents were more than machines. They were a testament to human ingenuity and obsession, to the extraordinary lengths men would go to in war. They were lessons, cautionary tales for engineers, soldiers, and civilians alike. By the end of 1945, Carter compiled the final report. He included photographs, blueprints, crew manifests, and first-hand accounts. His notes were meticulous. He described the Betty's thin fuselage, the unarmored fuel tanks, the ingenuity of the Fugaku network, and the almost impossible ambition of Project Z. He recounted the bravery, fear, and fatalism of the Japanese crews, making sure that the human dimension was not lost amid the technical marvels. Yet the final line of his report carried an uneasy truth. The war had ended, but the lessons of ingenuity, risk, and human courage lingered. The captured Bettys, the Fugaku network, and the designs for Project Z were silent now, yet their echoes could be felt in every decision made by engineers and commanders in the years that followed. Carter realized that history remembered not only who survived, but who dared, who risked, and who built machines that defied expectation, even if they defied survival itself. In his personal notes, Carter wrote, "We have measured the reach of human ambition. We have touched machines built to stretch beyond the limits of life. These bombers, fragile and brilliant, tell a story of courage, madness, and ingenuity. It is a story worth remembering, for in it lies the edge of what men will attempt when pushed to extremes." Decades later, the recovered Bettys and Fugaku components would end up in museums, preserved under glass. Visitors would stare at the thin aluminum, the unarmored fuel tanks, and the intricate electronics, often unaware of the human lives woven into the metal. Carter imagined them peering through the glass, thinking about technology, strategy, and history, never fully grasping the fear and devotion that had powered those flights over the Pacific. Yet for those who studied the documents, the photographs, and the oral histories, the story was vivid and unforgettable. The unarmored Betty, the Fugaku network, and Project Z were more than curiosities. They were symbols of audacity, of a war fought not only with bombs and bullets, but with ideas, calculation, and courage. They demonstrated that innovation, even fragile and deadly, could tilt the balance of a war, and that human resolve could match the might of steel and fuel. Carter closed the final folder for the last time and stepped outside. The sun rose over the Pacific, spilling light over calm waters that had once carried fleets, bombers, and dreams of distant conquest. He looked at the horizon and whispered quietly, "We survived because of luck, skill, and understanding. But we must never forget those who dared to fly fragile wings into the unknown." The story of the Fugaku and Project Z ended with the war, but it would live on in lessons, museums, and memories. It was a tale of courage, obsession, and ingenuity, a reminder that human ambition, even when bound by fragile machines and mortal risk, can reach heights few dare to imagine. And for those who knew the full story, the Pacific would never look quite the same again. Somewhere, far across the ocean, the remains of a Betty bomber still rested in coral reefs, carrying the silent legacy of pilots who flew knowing the odds, engineers who built against reason, and a war that demanded everything. Their story, fragile yet unforgettable, was a lesson for generations, that brilliance and risk are inseparable, that courage often meets fragility, and that the echo of human ambition can endure long after the guns have fallen silent.